Hello, all, and welcome to your lecture on environmental anthropology. I've put a picture of a Balinese water temple here because, as we talked about in our religion and ritual class, there are these really unique confluences of religion, nature, agriculture, with this culturally different worldview from ours of how we regulate water, how it's managed, how we perceive water, how we use it. And that's a big theme of the class today is how does our cultural worldview affect how we perceive nature and our role in it, and thus our interactions between people and the environment? We've talked about this perspective a little bit when we covered cultural ecology. We've discussed all through the class how there's this interaction between humans and the environment. The ecology, to some extent, constrains what we can produce or subsistence mechanisms, how labor is organized, how exchange happens, how these other cultural patterns of behavior like marriage and kinship, political organization, social structure, feed back into how we interact with the ecology to produce a lot of different options in any one ecology. It's never a one-way thing. Here's the ecology, here's the culture, right? But that we've recognized that there is this interaction. And culture absolutely can affect ecology, right? You think about using fertilizer or irrigation systems, not just in the US, all over the world. Dams, pollution, and climate change, all of these things are how we're interacting between culture and ecology currently. Now, to give you a perspective on how cultural worldviews and our symbolic systems of knowing and understand the world affect the way we live in it, I wanted to read you an excerpt from this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, where Robin Wall Kimmerer discusses her attempts to learn the Potawatomi language. She's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi, an indigenous group in the U.S. And she talks about this word to be a bay. So this is a picture of my son running in a bay. It's the Monterey Bay. We say it and the because in English the word bay is a noun. In fact, only 30% of the words in English are verbs. So like to run, to be a bay is a verb in the Potawatomi language. And in fact, 70% of their words are verbs. So it's a very active language. And a lot of the words that we take for granted, especially about the environment as a noun, a thing, a fixed thing, is actually a sense of motion. So this is what she says about trying to learn a language. The threads in my brain knotted, and the harder I tried, the tighter they became. Maybe this is your familiarity with trying to learn a language too. Pages blurred and my eyes settled on a word, a verb, of course, to be a Saturday. So in Potawatomi, you wouldn't say it's Saturday. You say today is being a Saturday. I threw my book down. Since when is Saturday a verb? Everyone knows it's a noun. I grabbed the dictionary and flipped more pages, and all kinds of things seemed to be verbs. To be a hill, to be red, to be a long sandy stretch of beach. And then my finger rested on Weekwegama, to be a bay. Ridiculous, I ranted in my head. No wonder no one speaks it. A bay is most definitely a person, place, or thing, a noun, and not a verb. I was ready to give up. Oh, the ghosts of the missionaries in the boarding schools must have been rubbing their hands in glee at my frustration. She's going to surrender, they said. And then, I swear, I heard the zap of synapses firing. An electric current sizzled down my arm and through my finger and practically scorched the page where that one word lay. In that moment, I could smell the water of the bay, watch it rock against the shore, and hear it sift onto the sand. A bay is a noun only if water is dead. When bay is a noun, it is defined by humans, trapped between its shores and contained by the word. But the verb weekwegama, to be a bay, releases the water from bondage and lets it live. To be a bay holds the wonder that for this moment, the living water has decided to shelter itself between these shores, conversing with cedar roots and a flock of baby mergansers, because it could do otherwise, become a stream or an ocean or a waterfall, and there are verbs for that too. To be a hill, to be a sandy beach, to be a Saturday, all are possible verbs in a world where everything is alive. Water, land, and even a day. The language is a mirror for seeing the animacy of the world, the life that pulses through all things, through the pines and nuthatches and mushrooms. This is the language I hear in the woods. This is the language that lets us speak of what wells up around us. This is the grammar of animacy. Imagine seeing your grandmother standing at the stove in her apron and then saying of her, "Look, it is making soup. It has gray hair." We might snicker at such a mistake, but we also recoil from it. In English, we never refer to a member of our family, or indeed to any person, as it. That would be a profound act of disrespect. It robs a person of selfhood and kinship, reducing a person to a mere thing. So it is that in Potawatomi, most other indigenous languages, especially in the Americas, we use the same words to address the living world as we use for our family because they are their family. So I encourage you to read the book if this is an interesting topic for you. She goes on to talk about origin stories and how they shape how we think about humans' place in the world. Is the Bay like a family member, or is it like a thing? She discusses how people from a Western European history think of themselves in relation to nature along the story of the Garden of Eden. There is us and there is nature, and nature either destroys us or we destroy it if we don't build a wall around that. And you can very much see that in the management styles of national parks today. Up until very, very recently, the primary mode of conservation was to build a wall around nature and say, there's humans and there's nature, and humans shouldn't be in nature because it's bad for it. In fact, Robin Wall Kimmerer, she teaches ecology classes, I think at Penn State or somewhere in New York. She was asking her students to rate their knowledge of positive interactions between people and land. And the median response, the most common response, was none. There are no ways for people and plants and animals to positively interact. And she says, I realized that they could not even imagine what beneficial relations between their species and others might look like. How can we begin to move towards ecological and cultural sustainability if we cannot even imagine what the path feels like? If we cannot imagine something like the gifts of the strawberries, which you'll remember I read to you at the beginning of the semester. If we're living in a gift-giving economy with nature instead of an extractive one, how does that affect our relationship with nature and our path forward? She says, in the Western tradition, there is a hierarchy of beings with, of course, the human being on top, the pinnacle of evolution, the darling of creation, and the plants at the bottom. But in native ways of knowing, human people are often referred to as the younger brothers of creation. We say that humans have the least experience with how to live, and thus the most to learn. We must look to our teachers among the other species for guidance. Their wisdom is apparent in the way that they live. They teach us by example. They've been on the earth far longer than we have been, and have had time to figure things out. They live both above and below ground, joining skyworld to the earth. Plants know how to make food and medicine from light and water, and then they give it away. So, unless you have Native ancestry or are a member of a tribe, maybe this is a new perspective to you and how to think, like how deeply this cultural worldview of what's the environment, what are humans, who else are humans, right? How deep that runs, very deep in our history, and how that affects our interactions. So here's all the words for you on the slide, just so you have it if you want to read what I said or have it for later for the students who can't make it. But I'm going to show you this video next time. I did want you just to have another quick example of how our worldview shapes the way we interact with the world. This is called a Gall-Peters projection map, and I've heard some of you may have experienced these in high school. It's a way to try to demonstrate the world on a two-dimensional surface, so in a square, basically, of what it looks like in a sphere. And if you haven't seen one of these before, it's a very different way to look at the world at first. What's up, what's down, what's in the middle, right? England is still in the middle here. The standard time around the world starts Greenwich Standard Time in England, right? What's in the outside on the edges? We got New Zealand down there. Up there, right? The size, a relative size of like Greenland versus Africa, especially, can be very surprising at first. So we'll watch a video on this next time, but just to give you an example of the way our cultural worldview has shaped the way that we see the world. If you were to look cross-culturally about how all different societies view the environment and humans' role in it, you'd probably bump up against this umbrella term called local ecological knowledge. And if you're a biologist or an environmental scientist, you might have heard of this before. I mentioned it briefly in our medicinal anthropology class. and it's people's knowledge of natural resources and management practices. So these are some families I was living with when I was down working with the Chimane in the Bolivian Amazon. And you have the grandfather on the left making fishing spears while his grandson looks on and learns the trade a little bit. And then you have the extended family on the right, the fish they've caught from their fishing expedition. So people's knowledge of natural resources and management practices includes ethnobotany and knowledge of plants, ethnobiology, knowledge of animals, ethnoscience, the way that plants and animals and other environmental forces interact. So it can be very basic, just you all have different local ecological knowledge. If you go for a walk in the foothills, do you recognize invasive plants versus native plants? Do you recognize this wildlife species that you see? So just basic, naming of things, but then also understanding their interactions as well. And these vary from culture to culture. Sometimes folks that I've worked with, like those in Bolivia, they'll have more names for a species than we do because they'll say, well, you hunt the females in the rainy season and the males in the dry season. Or, the burrowing female is different from the migratory male, right? And so they'll actually have different species names for animals than we will. Local ecological knowledge is primarily learned through experience and interaction. So here are some boys with one of those fishing arrows and the bow and arrow, and they're practicing in the river. If you've ever gone bow fishing for fish, I have not, but I've been told from these kids that it's really tricky because of the way that the water refracts the light. The fish is not actually where it looks like it is, so it takes a ton of practice, not just to craft the tools that you'll need, but then to actually have a successful fishing expedition. And so it's not a tacit thing either, this idea of local ecological knowledge. It's what world do you experience? There's a phenomenon called the shifting baseline, right? Where the world your grandparents know is different from the world that you know. And the one that you grew up with is the new normal. And so you're just working from that new baseline when you're looking at things like improvement or degradation, usually is what people talk about. But as you move through the world, your learned experience, your interactions with the environment shape personal local ecological knowledge and environmental relations as well. And then, of course, culture, is learned and shared. As people have these experiences and share them with another, you can have changing worldviews on humans and the environment. An environmental anthropologist, this quote comes from Tim Ingold. He has a really beloved book where he talks about this phenomenon that he names the ecology of life. So he says, organic life is a creative unfolding of an entire field of relations within which beings emerge and take on the particular form that they do. So it's not that humans exist in our isolation, the pinnacles, the darlings of creation, right? But we exist in terms of how other organisms perceive us and how they interact with us. So he gives this, kind of old diagram of the cat where the pinnacle of creation here perceives the cat, has this perception, the neural causes and correlates of consciousness, creates a neural representation of this organism, the cat, and then the cat exists as perceived by the external observer. If you could flip that perspective and think about how does a corn crop perceive us? How does a bumblebee perceive us? An almond tree, a mountain lion, right? How do they perceive us watering them or pollinating them or harvesting them? And how does that affect the unfolding of our life? The simpler way to put the quote is, does a tree fall in the forest if no one hears it? Like, what makes a river? What makes a bay a noun or a verb? What happens when we recognize ourselves in other organisms' processes as well as how we perceive them and interact with them and just thus drive our own fate? So one of the main themes of environmental anthropology today is looking at what happens to these relations in the face of change. Change is always happening, all the time, not just now, it always has been. So we'll talk about some stuff related to climate change, but that's just because it's the easiest example to discuss in this current moment. So this field of studies called political ecology, and it studies very similar to cultural ecology, the relationships between political and social and also economic factors to environmental issues and change. So, if we're existing in this field of relations, as this field of relations changes, what happens to human culture? How do our political and social organizations affect how humans go through times of change? What political ecologists will study is how costs and benefits are associated with environmental issues and change are distributed unequally. So, it's an examination of inequality in the face of change. As something like sea level rise occurs, you get this uneven distribution of costs and benefits. What sorts of political, social, and economic differences account for the uneven distribution of those costs and benefits? Some people are definitely going to benefit from climate change. A lot of people won't. Some of those folks who have already been deeply impacted live on this peninsula called in a little town called Kivalina up in Alaska. Way back in 2008, they sued ExxonMobil over flooding caused by climate change. So, sea ice has historically protected the village from storms. But as the sea ice around their peninsula has melted, you can see how they've built this like retaining wall here so when the winter storms come through, the waves will come up and like bash up the village basically. Um, the court case was dismissed on grounds that it's a political issue, not a legal one. They did spend millions of dollars to move the village off of the peninsula and relocated 2 miles south. They appealed the ruling. They lost. They're going to have to move their village again. And something like $100 million it's going to cost because of rising sea levels. Vanuatu, a low-lying island nation in the Pacific, lost 64% of its gross domestic product from a single cyclone in 2015. And a lot of coastal cities in the U.S. are also having to deal with rising sea levels and the very costly process of relocating people and relocating townships and villages and cities. And the question is, some people will win from that and some people will lose, and what affects who's a winner and who's a loser? Political ecology then also asks a second question. It says, okay, how, there's this unequal distribution of resources, costs and benefits, in times of environmental change. How does that affect existing social and political inequalities? And this is actually a good story. Not all these stories are like doom and gloom. This is the settlement of L'Anse aux Meadows. It's a Viking settlement in Canada. So they made it all the way to Canada during a period in medieval Europe called the Great Warming. And during this time, the climate warmed so dramatically that for hundreds of years, Greenland was actually quite habitable. And so there were settlements like these all over Greenland too for centuries as people moved there and raised their families and inherited land and made a living in this suddenly nice climate. And most of these new opportunities, right, because this land was not occupied by anyone previously. There are and were indigenous populations in the area, and there were obviously more people there during the Great Warming. But if you look at the history of the Viking expansion, you'll see that there's a lot of opportunity to be gained by those without land or with little land as they colonize Greenland essentially and build their farms. Now, of course, you get this contraction when the area cools again and people move, the Vikings have to move back to Scandinavia, Northern Europe. But in this case, environmental change created new opportunities for those without access to inherited land where they didn't have those before. Okay, so you can look at how it affects existing social and political equalities. And then you have this unequal distribution of costs and benefits when environments change, and you get changing inequalities, social and political. How do those alter power relationships? So suddenly you have landowners in Greenland, right? How does that affect who gets access to power in their society and who gets to make the rules about, feedbacks, right? Feedbacks, how people go through times of change and this distribution of cost and benefits, etc. So one of the things we've seen happening in the last 100 years or so is this desire to protect endangered large mammals like whales and elephants and that kind of thing, which are species that a lot of people have historically relied on for their livelihood. So as these species have become endangered? How does that distribution affect costs and benefits? How does that affect social and political structures? And how does that affect power relationships? For a lot of endangered large mammals, it has excluded individuals who have historically relied on them, and they've had to make lifestyle changes in terms of how they earn a living. When you read the Dobie Jawansi book, you'll read at the end of what the consequence of um, the basically settlement of the Dobie people to the government settlement has affected how they make a living and their role in society and who has access to their historically occupied land. So a complex topic, definitely an interesting one. If you're interested in politics and the environment, it's worth dipping a toe in these waters just to make sure that when you're in that meeting, and you want to contribute, you can say, hey, let's think about some of these long-term consequences. Because political ecology will attempt to contribute to better environmental governance, like informing policymakers of complexities surrounding things like development, the political environment and social regulations, how you understand community decision making, or collectively owned resources, natural resources, and the social impact on the environment from these unequal relationships within and also between societies as well. Okay, so I did want to talk, that's on a political ecology. Again, it's kind of the highlights. If you really like this topic, or if you're even vaguely interested, we offer a really popular class, Anth102E, a whole class on environmental anthropology. I did want to talk a little about urban environments, just to come back to that idea of how do we structure our worldview? How do we structure our environment based on our worldview? And I think urban environments are great environments to look at for that reason, because they're so intentionally motivated. As you walk across campus, nothing here on campus, maybe by the greenhouses, perhaps, but nothing here on campus is natural. Everything has been chosen and designed and landscaped by humans. I think campus is beautiful, especially now that it's the weather's changing. But if you look at parks in particular, I love park design, so fascinating. This is the most, one of a very well-known and popular park in New York City. Perhaps you've been there. It's called the High Line, highly designed. It's built on a raised train track. The train track was raised because it used to be on the street, and it was known as Death Avenue because the trains were mowed down so many, I shouldn't laugh. The train mowed down so many people, which is a tragedy. They raised the train track, the train was retired, and now they've created a park where it is. And they've incorporated all these aspects to improve your experience with nature while you're there. One of the simple things to see is the lighting so that you'll feel safe. This is a really important consideration in park design. But you'll also notice the way the boards are laid almost vertically to draw you through the space instead of crosswise. It's constantly creating this visual barrier. There's all sorts of native plants there, planted in a way that you can see, but also to create a sensory experience. And they've emulated this old train track here you can see on the right with the chairs, so you can slide the chairs around as you want to catch the sun or sit in the shade, and also to pay homage to the original use of the area. Urban environments can be beautiful, can be funny, especially when they're poorly designed, right? When something is designed for non-function, it's particularly humorous. But we did talk about choices and worldviews when we had our discussion on the lawn, if you remember that. There's nothing natural about the front lawn either. It's definitely a product of our cultural history and our desire to present as good citizens. But there's a lot more options, and have been and were a lot of different past uses of the front lawn historically than there are now because of this worldview of what should be in front of your house and how it's designed. But to think a bit more broadly about it, I want you to think about these complexities and interaction, and think about how the world assumes its form from being inhabited, right? Like how do you moving through a natural space, or you creating what you're planting in your lawn, or you visiting a park, how does that affect how the world is assuming its form? Because form is generated from intention and regenerated through use. And I've given you a cast iron skillet to raise this philosophical question. When does a cast iron skillet become cast iron skillet? Is it when it's made? What if you never use it? What if you use it for hammering in nails? Does it then become a hammer instead? A bit more literally, cast iron skillets do improve in their purpose with use over time as they become seasoned, right? And so you can think about, this is another main term for class today, how you and your movement through an environment assumes its form. And that's this idea of embodiment, with its fake Latin name, corpus habitus, the habit of the corpse, the habit of the body. How the development of an organism within its environment occurs physically, psychologically, and both together. So this can occur in the short term. You know, if they say if you, I've tried this, but I've heard that if you smile, it actually improves your mood. So you can give that a shot if you're having a bad day. In the medium term, if you have played an instrument, you'll recognize how your body changes as you play the instrument. You get muscles that strengthen. If you played a lot as a kid, it can even affect your bone growth. I still have a scar on my thumb from playing a musical instrument so much when I was growing up. Or long term, like our exposure to capsaicin when we're kids and our tolerance for spicy food as we go through our lives. So I think about embodiment a lot actually when I think about historic clothes and furniture, because if you've tried to like wear historic clothes or sit in historic furniture, it's weirdly uncomfortable. But that's just because you're used to developing with in your environment, and your corpus habitus, the habit of your body, has created a way that you feel comfortable in the world. And we'll bring it back to Ingold because he talks about this in terms of the relational model. And he talks about not just genealogical proximity, but the way that you move through the world is what creates your relationships with the environment and other people. So he says, it's not their genealogical proximity as determined by a past history of relatedness, but the extent to which their own life histories are intertwined through the shared experience of inhabiting particular places and following particular paths in an environment. And so maybe you have friends who you like to go and do things with, and you feel an affinity because you have those shared activities. Or maybe you were in a certain place in a certain time. You know, a lot of folks say, oh, where was I when Kennedy was shot or when the Twin Towers fell, right? That particular experience has shaped you, and people who have similar experiences, you will have this relatedness to. So it renders differences between people not necessarily as genetic, but as positional. And that's why when we observe cultural differences, there are almost as many differences between classes within a society, class-based society like our own at least, as between societies and geographically distinct populations, because it's the shared and learned experiences that you have. And that's why for authors like Robin Wall Kimmerer, it's particularly difficult to divorce the use of land from the personhood. And of course, that affects how we think about the legal role of humans and our rights to use the environment, right? As you think about the relational model. Okay, I'm going to close with some bits on urban environments again. Because they're so fascinating, right? The way that I'm talking about Paris to close, the way that they're imagined, designed, built, rebuilt, dwelled in. This is a picture of some of the uses of the catacombs of Paris. There's these originally burial tunnels where the rich would be entombed. There's the sewer. Some of those got turned into the sewer system, and some of those got turned into the underground system. But they're also in use currently as housing for some people or artistic spaces. We often think about environments as just existing. Oh, it's just there. You walk through the Grove Plaza. You're not aware of all the decisions that have been made and all the continual use and reuse of that environment and the maintenance of that environment. So you can think about how environments are imagined by people. This is the design of the city of Paris when it's being built, right? How are maps made? How are we currently reimagining urban environments versus the reality as they exist? How are they designed? What types of design elements do we think are important? How are they built? How does that constrain when we talked about art, the form, the methods, the materials, and the perspectives? How does that affect the way that architecture gets created? If you don't know, there's all these faces on this is the Pont Neuf Bridge in Paris. I didn't tell you that, but there's all these faces on the bridge by people who sponsored the building of the bridge. It was like bakers and lawyers and all sorts of things that went into creating the space the bridge was rebuilt recently. The restoration was finally done in 2007, and it was its 400th year anniversary. 400 years of this bridge existing. And how is it currently dwelled on? This is a painting from 1925, and there's still people very much dwelling on the bridge the same way that it was designed to be dwelled on, even 100 years ago. So I think as you move through your natural spaces today, whether you perceive them to be natural or urban, either way, think about the history of the space. Think about the norms and values and preferences that go into that space. Is it a car space? Is it a walking space? Are there native plants? What do you know? What's your local ecological knowledge of the space? How do you embody that space, and how does it shape you? And then, of course, the technology and all the other cultural aspects that goes into how do you perceive the space, and how does it shape your experience, and how do the two of you interact together? Okay, I hope you have a lot to think about. I hope you get to read the chapters for today, and I look forward to talking with you more about this topic later. Thanks.